I clutched Michael's boarding pass so tightly that my knuckles turned white, the paper edges cutting into my palm like tiny reminders of how fragile this moment really was. Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport buzzed around us with the familiar chaos of travelers rushing to catch flights, dragging oversized suitcases and juggling coffee cups. But all I could focus on was the gate number printed in bold letters, A12. First class seats 2A and 2B, just me and my 10-year-old son, finally heading toward the life we deserved. The morning sun streamed through the massive windows, casting long shadows across the terminal floor. And for the first time in months, I felt something I'd almost forgotten existed: hope. This wasn't just a vacation or a weekend getaway. This was our escape, our chance to start over somewhere William couldn't find us, couldn't hurt us, couldn't tear apart what little piece we'd managed to build. The divorce papers were still fresh in my purse, the ink barely dry on the custody agreement that had taken 8 grueling months to finalize. William had fought me every step of the way, hiring expensive lawyers and dragging out proceedings until I was emotionally and financially drained, but somehow, miraculously, the judge had seen through his manipulative tactics. Michael was mine now. Legally, officially, completely mine. I watched my son sitting in the uncomfortable airport chair beside me, his dark hair falling across his forehead as he concentrated on his Nintendo Switch, completely oblivious to the magnitude of what we were about to do. He thought we were just taking a trip to visit my sister in Seattle, a fun adventure before school started again in the fall. He had no idea that I'd already enrolled him in a new school, found us a small apartment near the waterfront, and transferred what little money I had left to a bank account William couldn't touch. My phone buzzed against my leg, and my heart immediately jumped into my throat, that familiar spike of anxiety that had become my constant companion over the past year. Every unexpected call, every text message, every knock at the door sent me into a panic, wondering if William had found some new way to make our lives miserable. But when I glanced at the screen, it was just my sister Sarah, texting to confirm our arrival time and reminding me that she'd stocked the guest room with Michael's favorite snacks. I smiled despite myself, remembering how she'd cried when I finally told her the truth about what had been happening. The emotional abuse, the financial control, the way William had slowly isolated me from everyone I cared about until I felt like I was drowning in my own life. She'd begged me to leave sooner, offered to help in any way she could, but I'd been too scared, too broken down to believe I could actually do it. The boarding announcement crackled over the intercom, and I felt my pulse quicken with a mixture of excitement and terror. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now beginning pre-boarding for Flight 447 to Seattle. We invite passengers traveling with small children, passengers requiring special assistance, and our first-class passengers to begin boarding at this time. This was it, the moment I'd been planning and dreaming about for months, the moment that would change everything. I gathered our carry-on bags, double-checking that I had Michael's medication, his favorite stuffed animal, and the folder of important documents I'd been secretly collecting. Birth certificates, medical records, school transcripts, everything we'd need to prove our identities and start fresh. My hands were shaking slightly as I zipped up the bag, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was anticipation, the kind of nervous energy you feel before jumping off a high dive, knowing the water below will either save you or destroy you. "Michael, honey, it's time to go," I said softly, reaching over to touch his shoulder. He looked up at me with those bright blue eyes that reminded me so much of my own father, and for a moment I felt a pang of guilt about taking him away from the only home he'd ever known. But then I remembered the nights he'd spent crying in his room after William's angry outbursts, the way he'd started flinching whenever his father raised his voice, the gradual dimming of his natural brightness as he learned to walk on eggshells around the man who was supposed to protect him. No, I told myself firmly. This wasn't about taking him away from something good. This was about giving him the chance to be a child again, to laugh without fear, to grow up in a house where love didn't come with conditions and threats. He deserved so much better than what we'd been living with, and I was finally strong enough to give it to him. We joined the line of first-class passengers, and I couldn't help but feel a small surge of pride at the luxury I'd managed to afford for this trip. It had cost nearly half of my secret savings account, money I'd been squirreling away for 2 years by skipping lunches and selling jewelry William had given me during happier times. but it felt important somehow to mark this journey with something special. Michael had never flown first class before. Hell, he'd only been on a plane twice in his entire life. And I wanted him to remember this day as the beginning of something wonderful, not the desperate escape it really was. The flight attendant smiled warmly as she checked our boarding passes, and I noticed how she looked at Michael with genuine kindness, the way adults do when they see a child who's clearly excited about an adventure. "First time in first class?" she asked him, and he nodded enthusiastically, his earlier video game completely forgotten in the face of this new experience. As we walked down the jet bridge toward the plane, I felt like I was moving through a dream, each step taking us further away from the nightmare our lives had become and closer to the future I'd been afraid to hope for. The recycled air of the airport gave way to the slightly different recycled air of the aircraft, and I breathed it in like it was the sweetest oxygen I'd ever tasted. Freedom, I thought to myself. This is what freedom smells like. Michael was practically bouncing with excitement beside me, asking a million questions about the plane, about Seattle, about whether we'd be able to see the mountains from the window. I answered each one patiently, savoring his enthusiasm and the way his face lit up when he talked about all the things we'd do together in our new city. This was the Michael I remembered from before everything went wrong. The curious, joyful little boy who used to build elaborate Lego cities and tell me stories about the adventures his action figures went on. The first-class cabin was everything I'd hoped it would be. Spacious seats that looked more like recliners, warm lighting that made everything feel cozy and expensive, and flight attendants who actually seemed happy to be there. Michael immediately started exploring all the buttons and compartments around his seat, his eyes wide with wonder at the personal entertainment screen and the little amenity kit they'd placed on his tray table. I settled into my own seat and allowed myself a moment to just breathe, to really absorb the fact that we'd made it this far without William somehow finding out and stopping us. The custody papers in my purse gave me legal right to travel with Michael anywhere within the United States, but I'd still been terrified that somehow, some way, William would appear at the last minute with some legal loophole or court order that would keep us trapped in Phoenix forever. But here we were, actually sitting on the plane, actually about to take off, actually about to start the new life I'd been dreaming about for so long. I was just starting to relax into my seat when Michael suddenly stood up, his face scrunched in that particular way that meant he really, really needed to use the bathroom. "Mom, I have to go," he whispered urgently, and I could see that familiar dance he did when he was trying to hold it in. The flight attendants were still helping other passengers get settled, and I knew we had at least another 15 minutes before takeoff, so I nodded and started to unbuckle my seatbelt to go with him. But Michael shook his head quickly, glancing around at the other first-class passengers who were watching us with polite interest. "I can go by myself," he said, his voice carrying that note of preteen independence that had been growing stronger lately. "I'm not a baby anymore, Mom." The words stung a little, even though I knew he was right. At 10 years old, he was perfectly capable of finding the bathroom on his own, especially on an airplane where there was literally nowhere else to go. I hesitated for a moment, my protective instincts warring with my desire to give him the independence he was asking for. The bathroom was just a few rows behind us, clearly visible from where I sat, and the plane was still on the ground with the doors open. What could possibly go wrong? "Okay," I said finally, "but come right back, sweetheart. We'll be taking off soon." He nodded seriously and headed toward the back of the plane, and I watched him go with a mixture of pride and anxiety. This was part of letting him grow up, I reminded myself. Part of showing him that I trusted him to make good decisions and take care of himself. William had never allowed Michael that kind of freedom, always hovering and controlling and making him feel like he couldn't do anything right. I was determined to be different, to raise a confident, independent young man who knew his own worth and wasn't afraid to speak up for himself. The minutes ticked by, and I found myself checking my watch more and more frequently. 5 minutes, then 7, then 10. The flight attendants had finished their safety demonstration and were now walking through the cabin, asking passengers to put their seats in the upright position and prepare for departure. My stomach started to twist with worry as I craned my neck to look toward the back of the plane, but I couldn't see Michael anywhere. Maybe he was having trouble with the bathroom door, or maybe there was a line I couldn't see from my seat. I tried to stay calm, telling myself that he was fine, that he was just taking his time, that there was no reason to panic. But the rational part of my brain was being steadily overwhelmed by the part that had spent the last year expecting disaster around every corner, the part that had learned to read danger in every shadow and threat in every unexpected delay. "Excuse me," I said to the flight attendant who was passing by, trying to keep my voice steady and casual. "My son went to the bathroom about 10 minutes ago, and I'm just wondering if you've seen him. He's 10 years old, dark hair, wearing a blue t-shirt with a dinosaur on it." She smiled reassuringly and promised to check on him, disappearing toward the back of the plane with the kind of professional efficiency that should have made me feel better, but somehow didn't. I watched her go, my hands gripping the armrests of my seat so tightly that my knuckles were white again, just like they'd been when I was holding the boarding passes. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones, that mother's intuition that kicks in when your child is in danger, even when you can't explain why or how you know. The flight attendant returned a few minutes later, her professional smile looking a little more strained around the edges. "I checked both bathrooms, and he's not there," she said quietly, leaning down so the other passengers couldn't hear. "But I'm sure he's just exploring the plane a little bit. You know how curious kids can be." Her words were meant to be comforting, but they hit me like a physical blow. Michael wasn't the type to wander off and explore. He was cautious by nature, always checking with me before doing anything that might get him in trouble. The months of living with William's unpredictable anger had made him hyper-aware of rules and boundaries, always careful not to step out of line. If he wasn't in the bathroom and he wasn't back at his seat, then something was very, very wrong. I unbuckled my seatbelt and stood up so quickly that I nearly knocked over the flight attendant, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. "I need to find my son," I said, and I could hear the edge of panic creeping into my voice despite my efforts to stay calm. He wouldn't just wander off. Something's happened. The other first-class passengers were starting to stare now, their polite interest turning into genuine concern as they picked up on my distress. I didn't care about making a scene or drawing attention to myself. All I cared about was finding Michael and making sure he was safe. The flight attendant tried to guide me back to my seat, assuring me that they would handle the situation, but I shook her off and started walking toward the back of the plane, calling Michael's name in a voice that was getting louder and more desperate with each step. The coach section was packed with passengers settling in for the flight, and I scanned every face, every row, looking for that familiar shock of dark hair and those bright blue eyes. "Michael!" I called out, not caring that people were staring at me like I was some kind of crazy person. "Michael, where are you?" A few passengers looked around helpfully, but most just watched with the uncomfortable fascination people have when witnessing someone else's crisis. I checked every bathroom, every galley, every possible hiding spot on the plane, but he was nowhere to be found. The flight attendants were starting to look genuinely worried now, radioing the cockpit and speaking in hushed, urgent tones that made my blood run cold. This wasn't just a case of a curious kid wandering off. This was something else entirely. Something that was making my worst fears seem like pleasant daydreams. By the time I made it back to the front of the plane, I was hyperventilating, my vision starting to blur around the edges as panic took over completely. "He's not on the plane," I gasped to the head flight attendant, who was now speaking rapidly into her headset. "My son is not on this plane. We need to get off. We need to find him. We need to call security." The words tumbled out of me in a rush, and I could hear how hysterical I sounded. But I didn't care. Michael was missing, and every second we sat here was another second he could be getting further away. Another second something terrible could be happening to him. The flight attendant was trying to explain procedures and protocols, but all I could think about was my little boy, alone and scared somewhere in this massive airport, wondering where his mother was and why she wasn't coming to find him. This was supposed to be our escape, our new beginning, our chance at happiness. And instead, it was turning into the worst nightmare I could possibly imagine. The next hour passed in a blur of security guards, airport officials, and endless questions that felt like torture, when all I wanted to do was search every inch of Phoenix Sky Harbor until I found my son. They'd delayed the flight and eventually canceled it altogether, which meant dozens of angry passengers glaring at me like this was somehow my fault. I sat in a small office near the gate, my hands shaking as I answered the same questions over and over again. When did you last see him? What was he wearing? Has he ever run away before? Each question felt like an accusation, like they were implying that I was somehow responsible for Michael's disappearance, that I was the kind of mother who didn't pay attention to her own child. The security footage was the worst part. Watching those grainy black and white images of Michael walking toward the bathroom, then seeing him emerge and head not back toward our gate, but toward the main terminal. He's not wandering aimlessly, the security chief observed, rewinding the footage. He knows where he's going. The cameras tracked him through the terminal until he reached the baggage claim area, where he seemed to be searching for someone, and then nothing. The cameras in that section had been down for maintenance, creating a 47-minute blind spot where my son simply vanished, and I knew with cold certainty that William had orchestrated every second of this nightmare. The police finally started taking the situation seriously once they saw William's face on the security footage, but by then, it had been almost 6 hours since Michael disappeared, and I felt like I was drowning in my own helplessness. They issued an Amber Alert and put out a bolo for William's car, a black BMW that I'd helped him pick out 3 years ago when we were still pretending to be a happy family. The irony wasn't lost on me that the car I'd once been so proud of was now the vehicle carrying my son away from me, probably speeding towards some predetermined hiding place that William had been planning for months. Detective Morrison, the older of the 2 cops assigned to the case, kept trying to reassure me that most parental abductions ended safely, that William wouldn't hurt Michael, because he was his father too. But Detective Morrison didn't know William the way I did, didn't understand that my ex-husband's love was possessive and controlling, that he saw Michael not as a person with his own rights and feelings, but as a possession to be won or lost. I called William's phone every 10 minutes, listening to it ring and ring before going to voicemail, his familiar voice cheerfully asking callers to leave a message. Each time I heard that recording, I wanted to throw my phone against the wall, wanted to scream at him through the digital void that separated us. Instead, I left message after message, my voice getting more desperate and angry with each one. "William, please, just bring him back. We can work this out. You don't have to do this." Then, as the hours passed and my panic grew, "If you hurt him, I swear to God, I will make you pay for the rest of your life." And finally, when exhaustion and terror had stripped away all pretense, "Please, I'm begging you. He's just a little boy. He needs his mother. Please don't do this to him." But the phone never rang back, and William never responded to any of my increasingly frantic texts. The worst part was not knowing what William had told Michael to convince him to leave with him, what lies he'd used to manipulate our son's trust and love. As midnight approached, I found myself sitting in the airport's 24-hour chapel, a small, non-denominational space that was supposed to provide comfort to travelers facing difficult journeys. I wasn't particularly religious, but I was desperate enough to try anything, to appeal to any higher power that might be listening. The chapel was empty except for me and an elderly janitor who was quietly cleaning the pews, giving me the privacy to fall apart completely. I cried until my eyes were swollen and my throat was raw, mourning not just Michael's disappearance, but the death of all the dreams I'd built around our new life in Seattle. The apartment I'd rented, the school I'd enrolled him in, the job interview I'd scheduled for next week, all of it was meaningless now. Just another set of broken promises in a life that seemed to be made up of nothing but disappointment and betrayal. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah asking if everything was okay, and I finally typed back, "Michael is missing. William took him. I'm still in Phoenix." The police had set up a command center in one of the airport conference rooms, and I spent the rest of the night there, drinking terrible coffee and watching them coordinate with law enforcement agencies across the state. They'd tracked William's credit card to a gas station about 2 hours south of Phoenix, but the trail went cold after that. He was smart enough to know that using plastic would leave a digital footprint, which meant he'd probably switched to cash for everything else. The FBI had been called in because of the interstate nature of the potential crime, and Agent Sarah Chen, a woman about my age with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, explained that they were treating this as a federal kidnapping case. The words should have been comforting, but instead they just made everything feel more real, more terrifying, more like something that happened to other people in news stories rather than something happening to me. Agent Chen asked me to think carefully about where William might take Michael. family in other states, friends who might help him, property I might not know about. The sun was starting to rise over the desert when my phone finally rang with William's number on the display. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely answer it, and when I heard his voice, calm, controlled, almost amused, I wanted to reach through the phone and strangle him with my bare hands. "Hello, Elizabeth," he said, like he was calling to chat about the weather. "I hear you've been looking for me." The casual tone, the complete lack of concern for what he'd put me through, the way he seemed to be enjoying this whole situation, it all confirmed what I'd known deep down but hadn't wanted to admit. This wasn't a desperate act by a father who missed his son. This was revenge, pure and simple, William's way of punishing me for daring to leave him, for thinking I could build a life without him. And my beautiful, innocent son was caught in the middle of it, a pawn in a game he was too young to understand. "Where is my son?" I demanded, my voice cracking with exhaustion and rage as I gripped the phone so tightly I thought it might shatter in my hand. William chuckled softly, that same condescending laugh he used to use when he thought I was being dramatic or unreasonable, and the sound made my blood boil with a fury I didn't know I was capable of feeling. "Michael is perfectly safe, Elizabeth. He's with his father, where he belongs," he said, his tone so matter-of-fact that it took everything in me not to scream. "You didn't really think I was going to let you steal him away from me, did you? Take him to some other state where I'd never see him again?" Agent Chen was frantically signaling for me to keep him talking while they tried to trace the call, but all I could focus on was the casual cruelty in William's voice, the way he spoke about our son like he was discussing a business transaction. "This isn't about Michael," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "This is about punishing me, and you're using our child to do it." "You're right," William said, and for a moment his mask slipped, revealing the cold anger that had been simmering beneath the surface for months. "This is about you thinking you could just walk away from our family, from everything we built together, like none of it mattered." His voice grew harder with each word, more venomous, more like the man I'd learned to fear during those final months of our marriage. I could hear Michael's voice in the background, asking something I couldn't make out, and my heart broke all over again, knowing that my little boy was there, listening to his father destroy what was left of our family. "Let me talk to him," I begged, abandoning all pretense of strength or dignity. But William's voice came back colder than ever. "Michael doesn't want to talk to you right now, Elizabeth. He's upset about how you lied to him." The line went dead, leaving me staring at my phone in the growing dawn light, feeling more alone and helpless than I'd ever felt in my entire life.